What would you do if a mysterious baby appeared on your doorstep carrying the locket of your deceased wife? This thrilling narrative unveils a rancher's shocking discovery that upends his life and leads him down a path of truth and vengeance. A wail sharp and sudden pierced the tranquil morning. The man, a rancher by trade, instantly halted his work, his shovel clattering to the ground, his heart pounded. As he raced towards the shimmering railroad tracks, what lay there would utterly dismantle his understanding of his wife's demise. A small bundle, haphazardly wrapped, rested amidst the cold steel rails, the infant no more than a few months old let out raw, desperate cries that echoed across the vast, empty prairie. But as he carefully knelt and cradled the tiny form, a chilling dread seized him. Around the baby's neck was a slender silver locket, identical to the one he'd interred with his cherished Margaret 3 years prior. A tremor ran through his hands. As he drew the infant closer, the ornate pendant was beyond doubt. He had acquired it for Margaret on their wedding day, ensuring their interwoven initials were etched upon its surface. His final act before her coffin lid closed had been a farewell kiss upon it, then placing it gently on her chest. Yet here it was, warm against an unknown child's skin, reflecting the dawn's light, just as it had countless mornings. On Margaret's throat the child's cries ceased, and it gazed up at him with eyes the hue of an approaching tempest. His thoughts spiraled, grappling with inconceivable explanations, grave desecrators. But Margaret's interment site had appeared untouched during his last visit a month. A malicious prank? Who in this isolated land even possessed knowledge of the locket's existence? He swept his gaze across the horizon, seeking any trace of the one who might have abandoned this infant. The vast plains stretched infinitely, disturbed only by his humble abode, and the shimmering rails that faded into the misty morning. Not a soul was discernible, no faint wisp of smoke from a distant fire. The infant's minuscule digits closed around his thumb, and a profound shift occurred within his being. This small creature required nourishment, shelter, safety, yet queries scorched his mind like corrosive acid. How had this child come into possession of Margaret's locket? From where did it originate? And why did meeting those gray eyes feel like confronting a reflection of his own remorse? He slowly rose, holding the baby close. The breeze intensified, bringing with it the aroma of impending rain, and an unsettling sensation that prickled his skin. As he pivoted towards his dwelling, a slip of paper drifted from the baby's swaddling and settled at his feet. He stooped to retrieve it. Penned in an unsteady script were 4 words that irrevocably altered his perception. She knows the truth. But as he fixated on the message, pondering the identity of she, he remained oblivious to the silhouette observing him from the ridge overlooking his land, an individual who had anticipated this very juncture for 3 protracted years. He surged through his front door, the infant's cries still echoing in his arms. His mind struggled to assimilate the recent revelation. She knows the truth. What truth could there be? Margaret had succumbed to a virulent fever during that harsh winter. The doctor, unable to traverse the deep snow, he'd gripped her hand as life ebbed, uttering vows he'd never fulfilled. Yet now uncertainty seeped in like a creeping mist. The baby required urgent care, so he set aside the perplexing questions. Concentrating on immediate actions, locating an antiquated wooden crate, he patted it with blankets, improvising a cradle by the hearth. The child's distress lessened as the room's warmth enveloped it. He warmed goat's milk and meticulously fed the baby with a clean cloth, observing those peculiar gray eyes, which seemed to scrutinize his features with unnerving acuity. As the infant drifted into slumber, he detached the locket and scrutinized it by the lamplight. Each abrasion, every minute indentation was precisely as he recalled. This was no imitation. It was Margaret's own keepsake. The note felt coarse against his skin. As he reread the 4 ominous words, his hands trembled as recollections overwhelmed him. The night Margaret passed, she had attempted to convey something vital. Her fever had been so intense that her words were fragmented, murmuring about confidences and absolution. He had dismissed it as delirious ravings. But what if it wasn't? He moved to the window, staring at the ridge where Margaret's memorial stone stood. For 3 years he had frequented that grave, speaking to the earth of his solitude, his remorse, his fervent yearning for one final exchange. Now he pondered, if Margaret had carried secrets to her tomb that another person possessed. A faint rap on the door caused him to stiffen. In 3 years of solitude, the man could recall barely a handful of guests. He approached the entrance with vigilance, his hand hovering near the sidearm at his hip. Through the pane, he observed an aged woman clad in a faded garment, her silver hair tightly confined. She clutched a well-worn leather satchel and fixed her gaze upon him with eyes that seemed to penetrate his very core. He unlatched the door, partially positioning his body between her and the slumbering infant. The woman offered a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mister, I believe you've discovered something that is rightfully mine." Her words struck him like a physical impact. His mouth became parched as he faced the stranger who inexplicably knew precisely what had transpired that morning. "I have no idea what you're referring to," he managed. She inclined her head, scrutinizing him like a predator examining its quarry. "The baby, sir. And more importantly, the locket she wears. I've anticipated reclaiming them both." considerable duration. His grasp tightened on the doorframe. How could this individual possibly possess knowledge of the locket unless she was the one who had placed the child on the tracks? Yet that notion sparked even more horrifying inquiries. Who are you? He rasped, his voice barely audible. The woman's smile broadened, exposing teeth discolored by age and concealed truths. Someone who understood your wife far more intimately than you ever did, Sir Margaret, and I shared many intimate discussions before her passing. Behind him the baby stirred, and emitted a soft sound. The woman's eyes glinted with an almost predatory eagerness. Began taking a step forward. Why don't you invite me inside? We have much to discuss. His instinct screamed peril, but his desperate need for answers superseded his caution. He stepped aside, permitting the woman entry, though keeping his hand close to his weapon. She navigated his dwelling as if familiar with its layout, her gaze sweeping over every detail with disturbing ease. You've rearranged things since Margaret's era, she remarked, tracing a finger along the mantelpiece. She always kept wild flowers here, said they reminded her of her youth in Missouri. A chill spread through his veins. Margaret had never mentioned Missouri. In fact, she'd consistently maintained she was born directly here in Colorado Territory. How do you know that? He demanded. The woman, still unnamed, settled into Margaret's old rocking chair as if it were her rightful place. Margaret confided many things during our lengthy talks, especially near the end, when the fever made her voluble. You were present when she died. His voice faltered. I never saw you. I was with her every second. Were you? The woman's eyes gleamed with a cruel mirth. Every second, even when you departed to gather more firewood, even when you stepped outside to implore for her recovery, even when you finally succumbed to exhaustion and slept for those few precious hours. His perception of reality wavered. He had left Margaret's side briefly, desperately. During those final days, the woodpile had dwindled, and the cold was accelerating her demise more swiftly than the fever. He'd been absent perhaps 20 minutes, racing against time to procure sufficient fuel to keep her warm. You entered my home while my wife was dying. I came because she summoned me, the woman retorted. She reached into her satchel and produced a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. She penned this letter 3 days before she died, having the preacher's boy deliver it to me. With unsteady hands he accepted the missive. The penmanship was undeniably Margaret's, though notably feebler than usual. His eyes traversed the lines, and with each word a profound despair settled within him. Please come, I'm dying, and there are matters I must confess, things concerning the child, reasons why I can never reveal the truth to him. He is a good man, but some truths would shatter him. Come swiftly, time is running out. The letter drifted from his fingers like a withered leaf. Child, what child? Margaret had never been with child during their union. They had striven for years, and her inability to conceive had been a quiet sorrow between them. Behind him, the infant stirred, emitting soft, cooing sounds. The woman's face illuminated with genuine affection for the first time since her arrival. There she is, the woman murmured, rising from the chair. My grandchild. The word struck him like a hammer blow. Grandchild asterisk. Margaret was my offspring, sir, my daughter who fled at 16 to escape a grave error. My daughter who was a new identity and fabricated a past to evade the repercussions of her actions. The woman's eyes welled with tears. And that baby, that exquisite child you discovered this morning, is the daughter Margaret gave birth to 3 months before she wed you. He reeled backward, his hand seeking the wall for balance. That's impossible. Margaret would have told me she would never. Would she? The woman's voice became brittle like shattered glass. Margaret spent her entire marriage living a deceit, sir, and now that falsehood has returned to haunt her. The baby's cries abruptly filled the room, as if sensing the crackling tension between the adults. But as he gazed at the woman claiming to be Margaret's mother, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The woman was reaching into her satchel again, and this time her hand emerged clutching an object that gleamed in the firelight. The blade in the woman's grasp shimmered in the hearth's glow like a reptilian eye. His mouth became arid as she held it nonchalantly, almost tenderly, between her weathered digits. Calm yourself, she soothed, observing his reaction. This antique belonged to Margaret. She carried it constantly after what transpired back in Missouri. The woman's voice descended to a bare whisper. It to safeguard herself from her child's father. His hand crept towards his firearm, but the woman shook her head with a mournful smile. I'm not here to harm you, sir, though I have every right to be furious for you keeping my granddaughter from me for 3 years. She rotated the knife in her hands, inspecting the worn grip. You see, Margaret made me a vow before she passed. She swore that should anything befall her, I was to come for the child she had concealed. His thoughts reeled. Margaret never had a child. She died without issue. The woman's laugh was sharp and cold as a winter gale. Oh, she had a child, all right, born in a Kansas City brothel when Margaret was barely 17. The father was a brutal man who owned the establishment, a man who would have murdered both Margaret and the infant had he known of her condition. The baby's cries grew louder, and despite everything he found himself moving towards her, the woman observed him with shrewd eyes. Margaret escaped one night during a thunderstorm. She continued, pregnant, terrified, with nothing but the garments on her back and that locket around her neck. She reached a missionary couple who assisted unwed mothers. They consented to take the baby and find her a suitable home. He lifted the infant, who immediately grew quiet in his arms. Those gray eyes, now strikingly familiar upon reflection, gazed up at him with complete trust. The missionary couple were the Weatherbys, the woman explained, kind souls who managed a small ranch near the railroad tracks. They raised Margaret's daughter as their own for 3 years while Margaret reinvented herself and eventually discovered you. Then why is she here now? He demanded, though a part of him already dreaded the reply. Because the Weatherbys died last week. The fever claimed them both within days of each other. The woman's voice faltered with genuine sorrow. Their final act was to place Margaret's locket around the baby's neck and leave her where they knew she'd be discovered. They'd heard about the reclusive rancher who lived by the tracks, heard about the man who'd lost his wife and held himself responsible for her death. The disparate pieces coalesced in his mind, like the mechanisms of a firearm. The baby hadn't been randomly abandoned. She had been deliberately left for him to find. But why? Margaret visited the Weatherbys precisely once after she married you. The woman went on. She brought them funds and extracted a promise never to contact her, but she also exacted another pledge. If anything ever happened to them, they were to bring her daughter to you. Why me? The query emerged in a choked whisper. The woman's eyes softened for the first time since her arrival. Because Margaret witnessed how desperately you yearned for children. She saw how you blamed yourself for her inability to conceive, unaware it was her own guilt consuming her. She knew you would cherish this child as your own. He gazed down at the infant cradled in his arms, Margaret's progeny, his wife's concealed child, now orphaned and solitary in the world. The enormity of it bore down on him like a crushing weight. But there's something further you need to comprehend, the woman stated, rising from the chair. Something Margaret compelled me to swear I'd reveal should this day ever arrive. She drew nearer, the blade still clutched in her hand, and when she spoke again her pronouncements obliterated the last remnants of his painstakingly constructed reality. Margaret didn't perish from fever, sir. She was poisoned, and the man responsible for her death is approaching right now. The revelation struck him like a corporeal blow. Poison. The room swam around him as 3 years of sorrow and self-reproach suddenly took on a grim new significance. He had blamed himself for failing to save Margaret, but someone had deliberately ended her life. Who? The query emerged as a mere gasp. The woman whose name he now realized she had not divulged moved to the window and gazed out through the drapes. His name is Silas Creed. He owned that brothel in Kansas City where Margaret worked. When she escaped, she absconded with something that was his, something worth far more than just one pregnant girl. His arms tightened protectively around the baby. What did she take? Intelligence, names, dates, financial dealings. Silas wasn't merely operating a brothel. He was laundering currency for highly perilous individuals. Margaret cleaned his office nightly, and she possessed a sharper mind than he ever credited her. With she committed account numbers to memory, recorded conversations, amassed evidence that could have sent him to the gallows. The baby stirred in his embrace, emitting soft sounds that surprisingly brought him comfort even as his entire world disintegrated. Margaret, his quiet, gentle wife, had been living with secrets that could have resulted in both their deaths. How did he locate her? He inquired, though a part of him dreaded the forthcoming answer. The same way he traces everyone who defies him. Money talks, and Silas had an abundance of it. It took him 3 years, but he finally tracked Margaret down. He came to your ranch that winter when you were away tending your livestock. The memory flashed like lightning. 3 days before Margaret fell ill, he had ridden out to check his herd following reports of wolves in the vicinity. He'd been absent overnight, returning to find Margaret uncharacteristically subdued and reserved. She'd claimed to be feeling unwell, but now he poisoned her slowly. The woman continued, her voice thick with fury, something that would mimic a fever, making her death appear natural. But Margaret was more resilient than he anticipated. She survived long enough to send for me, long enough to inform me about the evidence she'd concealed, long enough to make me vow to safeguard her daughter. Where is this evidence? His voice was steadier now, anger replacing the initial shock. Hidden in the one place Silas would never conceive of looking. The woman window, her complexion pale, inside the lining of that baby's blanket. Margaret stitched it there the night before she died, knowing that someday someone would require proof of Silas's actions. He looked down at the infant in his arms, seeing her with fresh eyes. This was not merely Margaret's daughter. She carried the proof that could bring her mother's killer to justice. And now he's coming for her. The woman murmured, her voice barely audible. I can discern the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders approaching rapidly. His blood ran cold as he followed her gaze through the window. In the distance, 3 ominous forms advanced across the prairie like harbingers of doom. Silas Creed had finally arrived to claim what he believed was his. How much time do we have? He inquired, already moving towards his armory. 20 minutes, perhaps less. The woman's hands trembled as she examined Margaret's knife. He's brought assistance this time, professional assassins by their demeanor. He retrieved his rifle from the cabinet loading ammunition with practiced precision. 3 years of guilt and sorrow had now coalesced into a chilling focused wrath. Margaret had not succumbed to illness. She had been murdered, and now her killer was coming for her daughter. "What is your name?" he asked the woman as he checked his pistol. "Ruth Caldwell, Margaret's mother." Her voice was steady now, resolute. "And I'll be condemned if I allow that fiend to harm my grandchild." But as he braced for the battle of his life, he couldn't shake the sense that Ruth was withholding more, something about why Silas so desperately desired the baby, and why Margaret's evidence was worth killing. For the sound of approaching hooves reverberated across the prairie, and time was rapidly dwindling. The thundering hooves intensified, pounding against the ground like an impending tempest. He positioned himself at the front window, while Ruth took post at the back, both guarding the sleeping infant like protective wolves. Through the glass, he could now clearly distinguish the riders. 3 men in dark coats, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats. The lead rider, atop a massive black stallion, exuded the self-assuredness of one who had never known defeat. That had to be Silas Creed. "He appears older than I anticipated," he murmured, scrutinizing the man who had murdered his wife. "Malevolence ages a man." Ruth replied grimly. "Silas has been amassing debts and spilling blood for 2 decades. He won't cease until he obtains what he came for." The riders slowed as they neared the ranch house, fanning out in a wide arc to block any escape routes. These were expert tactics. Not mere hired thugs, but seasoned killers familiar with their grim trade. Silas dismounted first, his movements deliberate and precise. Even from a distance, he could discern the man's pale eyes scrutinizing every window, every potential hiding spot. "Thorne," he bellowed, his voice easily carrying across the yard. "I know you're inside. I'm here to retrieve something that was stolen from me." He remained silent, his finger resting on the rifle's trigger. He would let Silas initiate the engagement. "I am not an unreasonable man." Silas continued, slowly advancing towards the house. "Your wife absconded with something that belonged to me, and I simply desire its return. Surrender the baby and the evidence, and I will depart. You have my assurance." "His assurance," Ruth muttered under her breath. "The same promise he gave Margaret before he poisoned her." The baby stirred at the sound of voices, her gray eyes opening to gaze at the ceiling. Somehow she seemed to perceive the danger, remaining perfectly silent, as if understanding that lives hinged on her quietness. "I have all day, Thorne," Silas called out. "But my associates here are growing impatient. They have a tendency to ignite things when bored." As if to underscore the threat, one of the other riders produced a burning torch. The message was unmistakable: "Surrender or witness everything burn." His jaw tightened. This was his home, his land. Margaret lay buried just beyond that ridge, and he'd be damned if he permitted her killer to desecrate her memory by destroying the life they had forged together. "Ruth," he whispered, "can you reach the root cellar with the baby?" "Not without them seeing me." "Then we make our stand here." He checked his ammunition one last time. 6 rounds in the rifle, 6 in his pistol, against 3 professional assassins. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. Silas was drawing nearer, now close enough for him to discern the cruel smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. This was a man who reveled in the suffering of others, who found satisfaction in terror and desperation. "Last chance, Thorne," Silas shouted. "I know the old woman is in there with you, Ruth Caldwell, Margaret's devoted mother. Did she recount how Margaret pleaded for her life, how she promised to relinquish everything I desired, if I would just allow her to live long enough to see her husband again?" The words were crafted to inflict pain, to provoke him into anger and recklessness. But instead of fury, a cold, lethal resolve settled within his chest. This man had tormented Margaret before slaying her, had made her final moments a living nightmare. "You made one error, Silas," he called back, his voice clear across the yard. "And what's that?" "You left me alive." The response was immediate. Silas lunged for cover behind a water trough. Just as his first shot tore through the morning air, the bullet struck one of the hired guns in the shoulder, wrenching him from his saddle. But as gunfire erupted around the ranch house, Ruth suddenly gripped his arm with frantic urgency. "There's something more," she hissed above the sound of splintering wood. "Something I failed to tell you about what Margaret took. It wasn't just evidence regarding the brothel." "What are you talking about?" Ruth's face was ashen with dread. "Margaret didn't just commit account numbers to memory, she stole Silas's most invaluable asset. The location of a Confederate gold shipment that was never recovered after the war, gold valued at over $100,000. The world seemed to slow around him as the full magnitude of Margaret's secret unfolded. She hadn't merely been fleeing a dangerous individual. She had been carrying information that could enrich someone beyond imagination, and now that information was stitched into a baby's blanket while 3 killers closed in on their position. "Confederate gold," the phrase resonated in his thoughts. As bullets fragmented the windows around them, $100,000 worth of pilfered fortune, enough to finance armies, enough to commit murder for without compunction. where he pressed reloading his rifle with seasoned alacrity, buried somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Ruth gasped, pressing herself against the wall as wood shards burst near her head. Margaret had committed the precise coordinates from Silas's private documents to memory. She knew it was her fallback, the only item valuable enough to preserve her life if he ever located her. But Silas had located her regardless, and contingencies meant nothing to a deceased woman. The fusillade escalated, compelling him to duck as a round whistled past his ear through the splintered window. He could observe Silas directing his men with military precision. They were closing in on the house from two directions, utilizing the outbuildings for concealment. The baby began to cry her wails, cutting through the pandemonium like a blade. Ruth immediately gathered her, holding her close while attempting to remain beneath the window line. "We cannot repel them much longer," she articulated, her voice constricted with apprehension. He knew she was correct. His ammunition was depleting, and Silas's men were shrinking the distance. In mere minutes they would be at the door, and then it would be finished. But as he observed the assailants advance, a desperate strategy began to form in his mind. Perilous, likely suicidal, yet their sole opportunity. "Ruth, can you ride?" "What? My horse is in the stable. If I can create a sufficient diversion, you might be able to escape out the back with the baby." Ruth's eyes widened with comprehension and dread. "You're speaking of self-sacrifice." Margaret would desire her daughter to live. His voice was steady, resolved. "And someone needs to ensure Silas pays for his actions." Another volley of gunfire peppered the dwelling, and he could hear Silas shouting commands to his men. They were preparing for a decisive assault. "There's a town called Silverton 2 days north." He continued, checking his remaining rounds. "The sheriff, there is an upright man named Jonas Webb. Take the baby, take the evidence, and tell him everything." Ruth clutched the infant more tightly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "There must be another way. Perhaps there is." His gaze suddenly fixed on something outside. "Ruth, how familiar are you with Margaret's knife?" "What do you mean? Is there anything extraordinary about it, anything that might hold value?" Ruth frowned, bewildered by the inquiry. "It's just an old blade. Margaret acquired it from a peddler years ago for defense." But as she raised it to inspect it more closely, her breath caught. There, barely discernible on the handle, were minuscule scratched markings she'd never noticed before, numbers and letters so small they could have been mistaken for ordinary wear. "My God," she whispered, "these aren't scratches, they're coordinates." His mind raced. Margaret had been even more ingenious than anyone had realized. She hadn't merely committed the location of the Confederate gold to memory. She had carved it into an item she carried daily, something that would never be separated from her. The blanket was a ruse. He breathed. "The true treasure map is on that knife." Outside, Silas's voice rose above the gunfire. "Burn them out. I want that baby alive, but I don't care about the rest." Flames began to consume the edges of the roof as one of the hired guns hurled his torch. Soon the entire house would be engulfed, forcing them into the open where Silas would be waiting. But now he held the advantage. Silas required the coordinates to locate his gold, and those coordinates were literally in their possession. It was time to reverse the predicament. The thunder of hooves intensified, and through the smoke-filled interior, he observed Silas's head whip towards the sound. 5 riders topped the hill, their badges gleaming under the morning sun. Sheriff Webb from Silverton, accompanied by a federal marshal and 3 deputies. "This is Marshal Hayes," a commanding voice echoed across the plains. "Drop your weapons and surrender." Silas swore, realizing his meticulously planned operation was unraveling, but rather than yield, he launched a desperate charge towards the burning dwelling. Resolute in securing his objective before the law could intervene, he met Silas at the threshold, and the 2 men crashed together in a maelstrom of blows and frantic effort. Silas, though older, fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast. They tumbled through the doorframe and rolled onto the porch, each man striving for dominance. "Where are they?" Silas snarled, his hand seizing his throat. "The coordinates tell me." But his indignation fueled his strength. This man had poisoned Margaret, transforming her final days into a terrifying ordeal. With a furious roar, he broke free and delivered a crippling punch to Silas's jaw, sending the murderer sprawling. The lawmen had now encircled the property, engaging Silas's remaining men in a ferocious exchange of gunfire. But he had eyes only for the man who had shattered his existence. "You wish to know where Margaret concealed your valuable coordinates?" he gasped, yanking Silas to his feet by his shirt collar. "She etched them onto that blade you're so desperate to find. But here's the kicker. She also etched something else." Silas's eyes widened with ravenous eagerness. "What?" "A message for the man who murdered her." His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "She knew you'd eventually come for them, and she wanted you to know precisely what she thought of you." From within the conflagrating house, Ruth emerged, holding both the infant and the knife, precious cargo safe in her embrace. The child was crying, but unharmed, and Ruth's face displayed grim satisfaction as she passed the weapon to Marshal Hayes. The marshal examined the minute etchings on the handle, his experienced gaze discerning the hidden coordinates. But there, amidst the numerals and letters, was indeed a message carved in Margaret's delicate script. Justice will find you empty. Silas saw the words, and let out a primal howl of fury. In despair, 3 years of pursuit, 3 lives ruined. And in the end, Margaret had delivered the ultimate retort. Silas creed. Marshal Hayes declared, "You are apprehended for the homicide of Margaret Thorne, conspiracy to commit murder and misappropriation of Confederate assets." As the lawman escorted Silas and his surviving accomplice away in shackles, he found himself standing alone with Ruth and the baby. The house continued to burn, but everything of true significance had been preserved. "What happens now?" Ruth inquired softly, gently rocking the infant who had finally quieted. He looked down at Margaret's daughter, for that is how he would forever consider her. Those gray eyes, that had seemed so familiar, now made perfect sense. They were Margaret's eyes, filled with insight and quiet fortitude. "Now she comes home," he stated simply. "Margaret desired me to raise her. And that is precisely what I shall do." Ruth smiled through her tears. "And the gold? The government can have it. I possess something far more precious right here." As the sun ascended higher, painting the prairie in hues of gold and amber, he cradled his daughter for the first time as her true father, not by lineage, but by volition, by affection, by the vow he had made to a dying woman who had entrusted him with her most profound secret. Margaret was gone, yet her legacy persisted in the child she had safeguarded even in death, and Silas Creed would spend the remainder of his days atoning for the evil he had wrought. The baby opened her gray eyes and gazed up at him with absolute confidence. In that instant, he knew Margaret was finally at peace. Her daughter was secure, her assailant had been apprehended, and justice had been served. "Welcome home, little one," he whispered, and for the first time in 3 years a smile touched his lips. The ordeal was over, a new existence was just commencing. Thanks for joining us for this compelling narrative of retribution and redemption. If you enjoyed this account, be sure to subscribe to our platform for more captivating tales from the Old West. Now, click on the video displayed on your screen to experience another thrilling saga of survival and vengeance on the untamed frontier. A story about a woman who vanished into the wilderness with her offspring, only to resurface years later possessing abilities that would intimidate even the most hardened desperados. Don't miss it. Click now. What was your favorite twist in this story? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more.